In this video, we're going to learn the basics of organization and hierarchy in 3ds Max. Alright, so whenever we start creating scenes that have lots of parts and lots of models and geometry and we have very complex scenes, we need to know the basics of organization and how to use hierarchy to keep things organized. So the first thing that we need to learn about is the Scene Explorer. The Scene Explorer is going to show you all of the objects that you have in your scene. It's going to show you the names of them, and then it's also going to give you some options like hiding elements. So this can be very helpful whenever we begin our process of working with complex scenes. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to hide all of the teapots in this scene. I could come in and select all of those. So if I left click on the Scene Explorer on one and then hold down Shift and select the bottom one, it will select that entire range. Then what I could do is actually turn them off by hiding them. That's one way of doing it. I could also turn those back on by clicking on that eye. And I could also have all of them selected and right click and say hide selection. Or I could hide unselected to hide everything else besides the teapots. Whichever way is perfectly fine. So that's how we can hide. The Scene Explorer is also going to show us how things are grouped or parented together. So let's say that I wanted all of my teapots to be in a single group. To group an object, we go up to Group and then simply create a group. We can give it a name, and we'll call it teapots, and hit enter. You'll notice that it creates an object called teapots, and this is technically a container or an object that is now parenting all of the selected objects to it. So if I were to select the teapot group, notice that it selects all of them and they can now be moved all together. Now with a group, let's say that we wanted to access objects inside of that group. So let's say I wanted to get rid of this teapot on top. To do this, what I would need to do is have the group selected and then go to Group, Open. You'll notice that I can now select the individual teapots of that group. You'll also notice that the group itself, when it's open, is denoted with this pink bounding box. So that's going to let you know when things are open, and whenever we begin the process of rigging, which we're not going to talk about in this course, you will need to close your groups as you proceed into the production pipeline. So I could come in and make an adjustment to this teapot on top. I could move it out and then down on the ground. Okay, and then I would go to Group and then Close whenever I'm finished. Now we can also dispel or get rid of a group by simply hitting Ungroup, or we could explode and all of the objects will be maintained in their own individual objects. Now this really works well if we have objects that have groups inside of groups. So I could select all of the boxes, create a group for those, and then I could select both boxes and teapots and then create a group and call it non-spherical objects. Okay, so now we have a group called non-spherical objects, and then we have boxes and teapot groups inside of that. So this is a way that we can organize our objects. Now groups are really great, but they do have their limitations. As we've seen, they don't allow for good animation. There may be instances where we want an object to follow another, but we still want one object to have freedom. So let's go ahead and select this non-spherical object, and let's go to Group, Ungroup. And so now we're left with boxes and teapots. And what I want to do now is I want to, let's say, have this sphere and this sphere attached together, but I don't want them grouped. I want to be able to drag the big one and the small one follow along, but then I want to have the freedom to move the small one if I need to. So this can be done by linking, or it's also known as parenting. So I'm going to select the big sphere here, and I'm going to choose the Select and Link tool, and I can left click and drag to the small sphere, and that will make the big one a parent of the small one. So you can see sphere 1, which is this one, is now a parent of sphere 3. Notice the hierarchy that we have here. Okay, so now if I move the big sphere, it should follow along. And actually, you know what? I did it in reverse. The small sphere is now the parent of this. So what happens if I've made a mistake? Well, this is very easy to do. We could just simply come up to the top and say unlink those objects. So now they've been separated out. Actually, let's select both of them and then hit unlink. There we go. So let's choose the child, and that is going to be a child of the big sphere. So child to parent whenever we do that. So let's go ahead and move the big sphere. Notice that they all come together, and then we have the small one, which now has its own freedom. The way that I like to think about this is a parent inside of a grocery store. As a father, if I'm going through the grocery store, my kids follow me as I'm moving throughout the grocery store. However, they do like to move around within a limited space as we are going up and down the aisles, specifically the toy aisle. I'm in that aisle, and if I move to a different aisle, my son or daughter will move to the next aisle along with me, but they still have the freedom to move back and forth between the different things that they want to look at. So parenting or linking is very, very good. It's something that we would use mostly in animation and rigging. It is something that we will need to know for later on. We are not going to get too in-depth with rigging and linking, but we will talk about organization. Now, the final thing that I want to leave you with on grouping and parenting and just organization in general is that naming your objects is very, very important, because what will happen with your objects is someone else is going to come into the pipeline and they're going to look for a specific object. Let's say that we have a scene that is very complex. It's a cityscape. We want to find a very specific building, but it's hard to find in the scene. I would want to go to my Scene Explorer and actually search for it in here, but if it's all named box 001, box through 1344, that's going to be very frustrating. I would hate to go through a list like that. So we would want to name our objects. So I would come in and name each one individually. And as we go through our project, we will keep the primitive names on some of them, but then when we start grouping them together, we'll give them their proper names and make it a lot easier to read. And we'll talk about good practices for naming. So to change the name of something, it's very easy to do. You can actually left-click on the object in the Scene Explorer and then give it a name, and we'll call this Sphere the Best. I don't know. Just you can see how you can rename these different ones. Now you can also rename them by selecting them in the scene, and you can come right over here and you can change their name. And then you can also change their color. Now color may appear not to have any real use, but you could actually select objects by color. But we'll talk more about that later. Now we can also make selection sets, and selection sets are really, really nice too. If you have a lot of little objects that are hard to select, like screws on an object, you could actually come up here to the top and create a new selection set. So let's call this spheres. And I don't necessarily want to group them together, but I just want to be able to select them at any time. I can come up here, choose spheres, and now it selects all of those. These are all great ways to organize your scene and how to set up a hierarchy that works best for you. So now that we've talked about that, let's go ahead and move into our next lesson, where we're going to talk about setting up reference images and some of the things you'll want to do, some things to watch out for, and just how to get them ready to start modeling your project.